Hello, everyone. I'm hoping you're able to hear me right now because I've already recorded this once, but the audio did not record. So I'm giving it try number two. How are you doing, everyone? I wish I could be there with you in person today, but since I can't, I'm hoping that this recorded video will help you to understand the material at the second half of Chapter 9 and help keep us on track so that we aren't getting behind in the class. So last time we talked about conflict and how to manage conflict in your relationship. And we're going to continue that conversation today. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to talk about some social influences on conflict. In particular, we're going to talk about culture, gender, and sexual orientation. We're also going to spend some time talking about how to move from unproductive conflict patterns to more constructive conflict patterns. And then, as always, we're going to end the chapter with some guidelines for effective conflict communication. So let's dive right in. One particular influence on the way that we do conflict is our culture. In particular, if you look at stereotypes of different regions in the world, Mediterranean cultures are stereotyped as regarding conflict as a normal, valuable part of everyday life. So if you look in the media, you'll see examples of this from movies like My Big Fat Greek Wedding that show Greek families engaging in conflict as kind of a part of everyday ways of doing life, to movies like The Godfather that show Italian families engaging in that same kind of conflict. Of course, with a little violence thrown in because it's The Godfather. But Mediterranean cultures are stereotyped as being very willing to engage in conflict, and it's considered very normal. Compare that with some Latin cultures, where often conflict is seen as an opportunity for self-expression and for dramatic flair. And that can be seen, for example, in soap operas from Latin countries. You can often see that kind of self-expression being characterized in those dramas. Here in the US, we're known as a individualistic culture, and that means that we're more focused on individual success than we are in collective or group harmony. And so that focus on the individual often makes our conflict competitive. So we often will ask during a breakup, for example, who initiated the breakup, because it's sort of seen as winning at the breakup. And that's very reflective of an American perspective on conflict. Contrast that with Asian cultures, which are known as more collectivistic cultures, where maintaining group harmony is very important. And in those cultures, therefore, conflict is often condemned because it is seen as disruptive to the group harmony and almost selfish to engage in. So solutions are often encouraged that maintain collective harmony, and that means that conflict is often dismissed, minimized, or even just denied altogether. What about gender? When it comes to gender, there are some differences that have been found. Women and feminine individuals tend to enact the conflict management styles that Wood described as loyalty and voice. This is another critique I have of Wood's styles. Loyalty and voice are both considered the more constructive, on the constructive end of the conflict management styles, and that loyalty is the more passive, voice is the more active. And that reflects gender socialization, where women and feminine individuals are often taught or socialized to prioritize relationships and value those, as well as to use talk to create and sustain closeness in relationships. And of course, there's the stereotype that women and feminine individuals are more likely to defer to others and compromise rather than sort of aggressively fight for a win. Now compare that with the stereotypes of gender in terms of men and masculine individuals and conflict. Wood argues that they are more likely to respond with exit and neglect. That's on the destructive side of her conflict dimensions. Again, another critique I have. And of course, that means that that's coming from a sense where men are often socialized to emphasize talk less, men and masculine individuals, as well as to minimize problems and use more coercive or manipulative tactics or to force resolutions so that they're winning. And what's interesting, though, is that men and masculine individuals often report experiencing more physical and psychological pain from engaging in conflict. And that has been argued as one of the reasons why men are more likely to check out of conflict physically or psychologically, is because of the desire to avoid that pain. What about sexual orientation? Well, because sexual orientation is been not studied nearly as much due to the social stigma around homosexuality, there isn't as much research in this area. But of that research that exists, it's not a major factor in how people engage in doing conflict. But what limited research we have suggests that gay and lesbian individuals tend to have fewer conflicts about sex, and are more likely to talk openly about sex than heterosexuals. It's probably because it's an area that has been stigmatized. So if you're already dealing with that stigma, talking about it is therefore somehow less stigmatized. Gay and lesbian partners often have this intra-gender empathy that can reduce conflict. So if you have two men that have both been socialized to be masculine, or two women that have both been socialized to be more feminine, then that socialization can create sort of a similarity that can make it easier to understand one another. Who talks more about their relationships? Well, in keeping with gender socialization norms, women and feminine individuals tend to be encouraged or socialized to talk more. So the more women that are in the relationship, the more talk there tends to be. Therefore, those who talk most about their relationships would be lesbian couples, followed by heterosexual couples with one woman in the couple, and then finally gay couples that have zero women would use talk the least. Okay, let's talk about conflict patterns that are unproductive. So this is going to be a giant lesson in what not to do. So when engaging in conflict, if that conflict is going poorly, this is how it starts, is maintained, and ends with unproductive conflict patterns. So starting with the beginning, if you are engaging in unproductive conflict, it all begins with a poor interpersonal communication climate. If you remember that from Chapter 8, we talked about the interpersonal climate as being the foundation of personal relationships. So in really unproductive conflict patterns, it often starts with a poor foundation, where the foundation is established by communication that disconfirms instead of confirms. And if you remember that from Chapter 8, confirmation is this gift of a pattern of communication that says, overall, you matter to me, I value you. And so if the foundation of your relationship is disconfirming communication, then that means that the pattern then is, I don't value you, or you don't matter. And so rather than validating the other, it disconfirms. Often those early stages of conflict with this kind of shaky foundation starts with cross-complaining, where one partner will bring up a complaint, and instead of just listening and being curious, the other partner cross complains, which means that they counter the first person's complaint with a complaint of their own. So instead of, getting curious, instead they think, oh, open season on complaints. You brought one up, so let me go ahead and bring up some that I've been storing up. And so cross complaining often just adds more problems to the table, and now it's that much harder to deal with it. And those negative climates tend to snowball, as we'll soon see in the middle stages of conflict that is unproductive. Okay, negative climates are often stoked by other forms of unconstructive, unproductive communication. For example, kitchen sinking. And this is an idea that has had many different names through the years. Wood calls it kitchen sinking, and that occurs when everything except the kitchen sink is thrown into the argument. I've heard the same concept called dump trucking, which the idea is you fill a dump truck with all of your issues and grievances and all of the little slights that happen in a relationship. You sort of store them up. And then at the opportune moment, you just pull the lever and dump all of those complaints on the person. I've also heard it called gunny sacking. A gunny sack is a burlap bag that people used to do sack races in, like where they would put their bodies in the bag and then just kind of hop to try to race. Who knows why? But a gunny sacking in this context is you have a large burlap bag and you're sort of saving up all of your complaints and criticisms and irritations with your partner. And then one day, the bag overflows and you just dump all of the contents on your partner. So the idea is that rather than letting things go, you store up your complaints and save them for that day when maybe your partner says something about you, or where you've just had it. Maybe you've been storing up months of complaints and then one more thing happens, like your roommate leaves the cap off the toothpaste and you're like, that's it. And you unload that dump truck, or you pour out that gunny sack, you throw in the kitchen sink and you say, here are all of the issues that I've had with you in the last 6 months. The problem with kitchen sinking is that because you're throwing so many issues onto the table at once, it's often impossible to deal with any of them because it's so overwhelming, and really nothing then gets done. So the alternative to that is focusing on specific issues rather than trying to address everything. How does this work? So let's say you're having an argument with someone and you bring up your concern and they start to bring up their concerns. You could say something like, hold on, I'm sure that this is an important issue for you, and that means that it's also an important issue for me because I value you and I value our relationship. But we've already got an issue on the table that I'd like to address before we consider any more. Can we please deal with this issue first? And then I'd be happy to hear what your issue might be. Keeping it focused on that specific issue is going to help you to resolve your conflict more constructively. Another thing that characterizes the middle stages of unproductive conflict is that partners start interrupting each other a lot, and that really disrupts the flow of talk and communicates a lack of respect for one another. In the later stages of that conflict, solutions become the focus, and that sounds pretty positive, except it's not, because rather than offering a solution and then considering it, often solutions are met with like a counter proposal, like, oh, well, I have a better solution than that. Well, no, we should do this. No, we should do that. And so the solution isn't really making forward progress because each person's proposed solution is met with a counter proposal. The other thing that tends to happen in these later stages is excessive meta communication. And that's where you start fighting about the way you're fighting, where you say, I don't like that tone you're using, or you're not being very very nice to me. And then you start focusing on how you're arguing to the point where talking about the way you're talking is discussed to the exclusion of the actual original issue. And the other thing that tends to happen in these late stages of conflict that's unproductive is that the communication reflects qualities of egocentrism, dogmatism, and self-perpetuation. And what that means is egocentrism is that sort of belief that my way is the right way and therefore nobody else can be right but me. And so it's where you argue from a perspective of, my way is right. Dogmatism is stubbornly clinging to your belief and refusing to entertain any possibility that you might be wrong or that other people might be right. And so, whereas egocentrism is coming from a place of superiority, of course I'm right. Dogmatism is, I sort of don't care. I'm going to be right and I won't accept anything else. So it's more of a stubbornness. And it's self-perpetuating because once you kind of go down this road of, I have to be right, then it is really hard to kind of be open to hearing anything from anyone else. And it sort of closes you off to being a good listener. Unproductive conflict doesn't involve dual perspective because you are so focused on self and your own perspective and being right. And so it seals off any awareness of common ground that could help you to resolve this issue more productively. So, in summary, unproductive communication, like what we see here on the left, can then be addressed by using more constructive communication, what we see on the right. So if disconfirmation is unproductive and communicates the meta message, you don't matter, then constructive communication in a conflict would involve validating the other person and making sure they know that they matter to you. Kitchen sinking is throwing in every complaint that you had and stored up over the last 6 months or longer, whereas focusing on specific issues helps you to keep it constructive by keeping your focus on just the issue at hand. Offering counter proposals can mean that you just keep coming up with more ideas and not really addressing the value of any of them. Whereas offering compromises shows that you're willing to give up something of what you want in order to make sure that your partner gets something that they want. And that tends to be perceived really positively. Excessive meta-communication, where your focus is on the way you're arguing to the exclusion of even addressing the main reason that you started fighting to begin with, can instead be replaced with useful meta-communication, where you talk about what it is you appreciate about the way your partner is communicating with you. In terms of summarizing self-concerns, where you just keep kind of reiterating what you want over and over, it's helpful to summarize both parties' concerns. That reflects dual perspective and shows that you're willing to and understand. You're willing to understand both their point of view and your own, and it helps both parties to know that they're being heard so that they stop repeating themselves and instead focus on moving forward together. More unproductive patterns include things like interrupting, whereas obviously more constructive versions of that would be interrupting less. Poor listening is transformed into constructive communication by being a good listener, using paraphrasing and clarifying questions to get curious about your partner rather than shutting them down. Being preoccupied with the self is that egocentrism. It's all about me, dogmatism, I'm always right. And instead engaging in dual perspective, trying to see things from both your own and your partner's point of view, and looking for any opportunity for common ground. Cross-complaining then is transformed into considering your partner's concerns instead of just countering their concerns with a concern of your own. So instead, when a person says, here's something I'm concerned about, instead of jumping in with, well, you're not perfect either, instead you listen to that concern, you get curious about it, you ask questions and try to learn more. And we try to avoid hostile mind reading. We talked about that in the listening chapter as well. Instead of assuming that you already know what your partner is going to say, seek clarification and ask those clarifying questions to really make sure that you understand the issue. As always, we end every chapter with some guidelines for effective communication, and this is no different. So these are guidelines for effective conflict communication. First, focus on the overall communication system. If you remember back in chapter 1, we talked about how communication is going to involve systems, and that is all kinds of different parts that are affected by and influence one another. In this case, we talked about how every conflict situation is going to involve a me, a you, a situation, and a topic. And those are all part of the system. And so if you focus on the whole system, then we'll come up with conflict management styles like leveling, where all of those elements are addressed and valued rather than dismissing or ignoring one or more of them. You also want to time your conflict effectively, and that means make sure that both of you have time and are fully present in the moment. Not that you're rushed or, psychologically checked out. You don't want to start a conflict when one of you has to go to work in 15 minutes, or when you've already got a big test planned for the next day, or there's some other major event that is coming right up, or when your partner's already stressed about something else. So make sure it's a time that works for both of you and be flexible to make that happen. The times that are most convenient for you may not be the times that are most convenient for your partner. So make sure that you're flexible in terms of, finding a time that works for both of you. Use bracketing to keep the discussion focused. Bracketing, if you know, a bracket on a keyboard it's kind of the squared version of a parentheses. And brackets help you to keep the discussion focused by specifying the time period or the situation in which the conflict occurs. So a very global complaint would be something like, you always forget to take out the trash. Instead of saying things like always or never, bracketing keeps it focused on a particular time period or in a particular situation. Like when it's finals week, you never take out you don't take out the trash, or you know, it's your job to take out the trash on Mondays, and I'd like you to do that. So bracketing keeps it just focused on a specific time period instead of using like you always do this, or you're never around, or you're always a slob. Those are not time specific or situation specific. Aim for win-win conflict when you can. Look for opportunities so that both parties feel like they're getting something of what they were looking for, rather than focusing on being the sole winner. Show grace when appropriate. And that's the idea that even when there's no reason or standard that says that you should forgive someone, sometimes it's good to do that because you're putting the relationship first instead of your own needs first. And so showing grace is always a kind thing to do. And you don't want to do it necessarily all the time. You don't want to just be a doormat that never stands up for yourself. But there are times where you look at your partner and think the right thing to do here is, and the right thing to do for our relationship is to just grant forgiveness, even though I don't necessarily have to. And that can be good for your relationship. Ideally, you want to honor both me, you, and the relationship, right? And if you can do that, then you'll be able to manage conflict in ways that are productive and that help your relationship to flourish. So what I'd like you to do now is, just like we always ask at the end of a chapter, think about how you could use these concepts to become a more competent communicator in conflict situations. So think of 3 things that you can take away from this conflict chapter on how to be a better communicator in conflict. If you can think of 3, then we are done for today. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching this video, and I look forward to seeing you in class on Thursday. Thanks, everybody.